Hello guys, and welcome to our second video where we're going to be talking about how chemistry relates to life. And biology, as you all know, is the science of life. And so since chemistry is so involved in that, we have to go over some basic chemistry concepts before we move in depth on biology. So our four main concepts or themes in this video will be elements and compounds, atomic structure, bonds, and reactions. So first, let's start off with our elements and compounds theme. So an element is an atom which cannot be broken down further and still retain its properties. So for example, as I said in the last video, a gold is an example of an element because a gold atom is the smallest amount of that atom that still retains all the properties of that gold atom. If I was to say combine it with another atom of say silver or hydrogen or some other element, it would not retain those properties. And further, I cannot break down that gold atom into even smaller pieces, which are the protons, neutrons, and electrons, and expect to find the same properties. I really want to reiterate this, that all protons, electrons, and neutrons are the same regardless of what element they make up. Now, all these elements are classified on the periodic table, which lists various statistics about these elements. So now let's talk about compounds. So compounds are multiple elements in a fixed ratio, and we see this all the time. So for example, CO2, H2O, H2, O2, those are examples of compounds. So essential elements are elements which are needed for life, such as hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen perhaps. Whereas trace elements are needed in small quantities. For example, iron is needed for your red blood cells to function properly, and iodine is needed to prevent a disease called goiter in which your thyroid gland inflates. So trace elements are still needed, just in small quantities. Even if those small quantities are not provided, that can still result in the same consequences, if not worse consequences, as not having an essential element. So now let's move on to our second theme of atomic structure. So an atom is the smallest unit of an element that still retains all the properties of that element. So you can't cut up an atom into its parts and expect to see the same properties. So our three main parts of an atom are proton, neutron, and electron. So the proton and neutron are located inside the nucleus, and outside the nucleus are what we call shells, also sometimes called energy levels, and these are inhabited by electrons. So let's take a look at an example of an atom here. So this right here is a hydrogen atom. This right here is a hydrogen atom. As you can see, there's one proton and one neutron each inside the nucleus, and then we have an electron orbiting outside. Obviously, most atoms are way more complex than this. They have multiple shells, multiple electrons, multiple protons, and multiple neutrons. Okay. So then we have our valence shell. So our valence shell is always our outermost shell and determines the chemical behavior of the element. So another thing I want to point out about these shells right here, the first shell can maintain 2 electrons within that shell. All subsequent cells, or at least the next 2 cells, can maintain 8. The next one can maintain 8, then after that goes to 18, then to 32, and then it collapses back down. So there can be only up to 8 electrons in the outermost shell. And so all atoms want to get to 8 electrons because then they are happy, with quotation marks around the word happy. So they will do anything to try and get towards that 8, and chemistry involves a lot of studies of that behavior of those atoms to try and get to 8. So any element without those 8 electrons in that valence shell will be reactive. Now, to be stable, protons have to equal the number of electrons. So for example, as with our hydrogen atom, hydrogen has 1 proton. So to be stable, it must have 1 electron. Now, when this doesn't happen, when protons are greater than electrons, or when electrons are greater than protons, we have what is known as an ion. Now, an ion is an atom that has charge in it. And so the behavior of those is also important to chemistry, and a lot of chemistry involves study of ions. Now, atomic number is the number of protons, and this is what determines which element the element actually is. So, for example, nitrogen has 7 protons, whereas oxygen has 8 protons. So when you if a proton enters an atom somehow, then it changes what that element is. So let's move on to our third theme of bonds. So there are many types of bonds, but we're only going to cover a few here. And so the first one is called chemical bond. So a chemical bond just forms when atoms complete their valence shells. Well, let's take an example. NaCl. It's a common compound. It's commonly called table salt. And so this is formed by Na, which is Na is sodium, and then Cl is chlorine. And so Na, which is the sodium, has 1 valence electron, and chlorine has 7 valence electrons. So then these combine, or they bond together and fill their valence shells by sharing them. But now covalent bonds are slightly different, because this is when the atoms share pairs of electrons together. So, for example, hydrogen and hydrogen are 2 hydrogens here. What they would do to get closer to that magic number 8 is bind together. So now these 2 hydrogens would be, their outermost shell would be linked together. So this electron would go around and then go around the other one, and so on. And so we would be sharing this electron right here with this electron right here. And so because of that we have a covalent bond, since we're sharing pairs of electrons. And in some cases we can have double, triple, or even quadruple covalent bonds. Now let's cover another concept also known as electronegativity. So this is the attraction of an atom to the electrons within the covalent bond. And so our common way of measuring this is something called the Pauling scale. Now the Pauling scale ranges from 0 up to 4. And so our most electronegative element is going to be fluorine, which is usually estimated at around 3.8 to up to 4 on the Pauling scale. Which brings us into our discussion of some particular types of covalent bonds. So a nonpolar covalent bond is when the electrons within the pair are shared equally. And so this occurs between atoms of the same element, but it can also occur between atoms of different elements, considering the difference of their electronegativities on the Pauling scale. So usually this happens anywhere from 0.2 to 0.5 on the Pauling scale. Now, a polar covalent bond is when electrons are shared unequally, because some atoms are more electronegative than others, and when this difference is big enough, that causes a polar covalent bond. So when this difference is 0.5 to 1.6, then we have a polar covalent bond. Now I want to show you oxygen right here, and so oxygen right here is one of the most electronegative elements besides fluorine, and so we have, as you can see, we have a small negative charge here within our water compound right here, because this is H2O. And so because we have a small negative charge near the oxygen, we have a positive charge that forms on the side of the hydrogens. So then an ionic bond is a bond between 2 different ions. So when we have ions, they're attracted to each other. So another example of this NaCl, and I know you're probably thinking, well, what about the chemical bond? Isn't that an example? Yeah, because they are trying to complete their valence shells, but they are also attracted by the fact that there is a difference in the charges. And so what's going to happen is that one of the electrons from Na will be moving towards Cl, and that's what creates the partial positive charge on the Na part of the NaCl. And on the Cl part, we have a partial negative charge, and so that's why they bond together, because of that ionic bond. And so this usually occurs when the difference is above 1.6 on the Pauling scale, so we're talking about an extremely strong difference in electronegativities. And then we have a really weak bond known as hydrogen bonds. So this occurs when hydrogen and an extremely electronegative atom bond with each other. So a good example is, say, water, which is H2O, and NH3 are good examples of this kind of hydrogen bond. And if you ever wondered why lizards or geckos can walk up walls, it's because they have constant hydrogen bonds forming and then breaking apart, forming and breaking apart. Now, usually hydrogen bonds are really weak, but when these happen so frequently, so constantly, then it can result in, adhesion, which is a fancy word for sticking to a wall. And so that's why lizards, like geckos, can climb up walls without falling off due to gravity. So now we address our final theme, which is reactions. So chemical reactions start with a reactant, which is what gets reacted on, and then it concludes with a product at the end. So for example, photosynthesis starts with reactants and ends with the products of energy, which is mostly shown through ATPs, which is, we're going to learn more about that. It's basically the energy currency in biology. And so chemical equilibrium is when there's no net effect on reactants and products anymore. So a lot of chemical reactions can be reversed. So they can go in one direction or they can go in the other direction. So from left to right or from right to left when we write down these chemical reactions. And so these reactions will continue going on until a certain point when the reactants and products no longer, for lack of a better word, diffuse in one way. So when that happens, there could still be reactions going on back and forth, but in the end, the reactants and the products are not going to be changing. So thank you guys for watching our second video, Chemistry and Life, where we covered elements and compounds, atomic structure, bonds, and reactions. Please subscribe and like to this channel and this